The smell of Thanksgiving should be warm, a comforting blanket of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and cinnamon from the pumpkin pie. But in my family's house, or rather, the house my grandparents left behind, it was always laced with something else. The sharp, metallic scent of tension. The bitter aroma of unspoken resentments. For the past 2 years, since Grandma and Grandpa passed, every holiday had felt less like a celebration and more like a ceasefire, one that was perpetually on the verge of breaking. I knew this year would be different. I could feel it the moment I walked through the door. My sister, Clara, the self-appointed new matriarch of the family, greeted me not with a hug, but with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. It was the kind of smile a shark gives right before it bites. "Alex, you made it," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. We were just about to start. The "we" was a very deliberate choice of word. It was her, my parents, my Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol, and my 2 cousins, Mark and Sarah. They were all gathered in the formal dining room, a room I had dusted and polished just 2 days prior. They were already seated, a silent tribunal waiting for the accused to arrive. My seat, the one at the far end of the table, was conspicuously empty. I placed the bottle of wine I'd brought on the sideboard. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Clara." The dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. "Oh, Alex, still with that little art blog of yours?" my mother asked, daintily dabbing her lips with a napkin. "It's so quaint. Your cousin Mark just made junior partner at his law firm." Mark puffed out his chest. "It's a lot of work, but the rewards are substantial." He glanced at my well-worn blazer. "Very substantial." "And Sarah is finishing her MBA, Uncle Robert chimed in, carving the turkey with unnecessary force. "Top of her class. We're expecting big things. Big, profitable things." I just smiled and ate my mashed potatoes. I was the family's designated black sheep. While they all pursued careers in law, finance, and business, what they called real jobs, I had taken a different path. I was a digital archivist and online content creator, focusing on historical preservation. To them, I was a perpetual child playing on the computer. They conveniently forgot that my quaint blog and consulting work paid my bills and then some, without a single cent of help from any of them. In fact, it was quite the opposite, but they didn't know that. Not yet. The true source of their animosity, however, was the house. This house. When our grandparents died, everyone expected it would be left to my parents, or perhaps split among all the children. Instead, their will was shockingly clear: the entire estate, including the house and a considerable trust fund, was left solely to me. The will stated it was because I was the only one who had shown the diligence and respect required to be a proper steward of the family's legacy. In private, my grandfather's lawyer told me the real reason: my grandparents knew their children and other grandchildren were vultures. They saw the greed in their eyes. They left me everything to protect it, and to protect me. My family never forgave me for it. They saw it as a grand betrayal, a theft. They lived under the assumption that I was just a glorified caretaker, and that eventually, I would do the right thing and sign the property over to them. For 2 years, I had endured their barbs and their schemes, all while quietly managing the estate and, unbeknownst to them, handling the myriad of financial problems they constantly created. Tonight, their patience had clearly run out. After the dessert plates were cleared, Clara stood up, tapping her wine glass with a spoon. The clinking sound echoed in the suddenly silent room. She held a piece of paper in her hand. "Family," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced, solemn tone. "We are gathered here today to give thanks. Thanks for our health, for our prosperity, and for the bonds that tie us together." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. "But sometimes, those bonds become frayed. Sometimes, one link in the chain refuses to pull its weight. Sometimes, a link is so corroded, it threatens the integrity of the entire chain." My father nodded gravely. My mother looked down, refusing to meet my gaze. My cousin smirked. This was it. The ambush I had been subconsciously preparing for. For 2 years, we have tried to be patient, Clara continued, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. We have tried to appeal to a sense of duty, of familial love. We have waited for Alex to do what is right, to acknowledge that this house, this legacy, belongs to all of us, not just one person who was lucky enough to be the favorite. A murmur of agreement went around the table. But our patience has its limits. A family is a democracy of the heart. It's about belonging, about shared values. And Alex, you simply don't share our values. You don't understand what it means to be one of us. She held up the piece of paper. So, we took a vote. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. I had expected a confrontation, an argument, maybe even an ultimatum. But a vote? The sheer, childish absurdity of it was staggering. The motion was simple, Clara announced, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Is Alex truly part of this family anymore? Does he belong at this table? The results were unanimous. She looked around at the nodding heads, each one a nail in the coffin of my old life. We voted, and you're not family anymore. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that chilled me to my core. My Uncle Robert started clapping. Then Mark joined in, then my father. Soon, the entire table, except for me, was erupting in cheers and applause. They were celebrating my excommunication. They were applauding as they severed the final thread that connected me to them. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't even stand up. The meticulous, color-coded files in my briefcase suddenly felt like a ton of bricks. The plans I had made, the contingencies I had prepared with my lawyer, it was all real now. They had pushed the button themselves. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The frantic bird in my chest stopped fluttering and grew still. I looked at their jeering, triumphant faces, and I felt a profound sense of pity. They had no idea what they had just done. I let out a soft, low laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. The cheering faltered. My laugh had cut through their celebration like a razor. All eyes were on me. What's so funny? Clara snapped, her victory lap interrupted. I slowly raised my head and met her gaze. Nothing, I said, my voice even. You're right. A family is about shared values. I pushed my chair back and stood up. So, if I'm not family anymore, I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then I guess you won't need this. I reached down and lifted my leather briefcase onto the table. I clicked it open and pulled out a thick, navy blue folder. It wasn't heavy, but it felt momentous. It was 2 years of their secrets, their failures, their lies. It was my grandfather's final gift to me, the truth. I placed the folder squarely in the middle of the table with a soft thud. It was addressed in simple block letters, the Whitaker family legacy, a full accounting. Clara stared at it, her brow furrowed in suspicion. What is that? More of your little stories? In a way, I said. It's the story of this family. The real one. The one Grandpa and Grandma wanted me to know. Go on, open it. As the new matriarch, you should be the first to read it. A nervous energy now filled the room. The triumphant smiles had been replaced with looks of uncertainty. My father shifted in his seat. My mother was wringing her hands. Clara, never one to back down from a challenge, snatched the folder. Her movements were jerky, aggressive. This is ridiculous. Some kind of pathetic stunt. She untied the string and opened the cover. The first page was a single sheet of heavy bond paper. It was a letter, but her eyes immediately dropped to the bottom, to the copy of a legally notarized document beneath it. The color drained from her face. Her smug expression dissolved into pure, unadulterated shock. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from the page, to me, and back to the page. Her hands began to tremble, rattling the papers. What is it, dear? My mother asked, her voice a nervous tremor. Clara didn't answer. She just stared at the page, her breathing growing ragged and shallow. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. A wild, primal fear. And then, she started screaming. It wasn't a shout or a cry of anger. It was a raw, guttural shriek of absolute horror, the sound of someone whose entire world had just been obliterated by a single piece of paper. The scream tore through the festive air, shattering the last vestiges of their victory and marking the true beginning of our Thanksgiving dinner. Clara's scream was a physical thing. It clawed at the air, bounced off the polished wood of the dining room, and silenced every other sound. For a moment, everyone was frozen, a tableau of confusion and nascent panic. My uncle half rose from his chair. My mother flinched as if struck. My father's face was a mask of disbelief. The scream finally subsided into a series of ragged, gasping breaths. Clara was hyperventilating, her knuckles white as she gripped the folder. "No," she whispered, the word a desperate prayer. "No. You can't. It's a lie. It's a forgery." "Is it?" I asked calmly, my voice cutting through the chaos. I didn't move from my spot. I was the eye of the hurricane I had just unleashed. "Look at the notary seal, Clara. Look at the date. Look at the signature from the bank's vice president. It's all quite real." My Uncle Robert finally found his voice. "What in God's name is going on? What is that paper?" He reached for the folder, but I held up a hand. "Let her read it." She wanted to be the head of the family. The head of the family should know the truth. Clara was still shaking her head, but her eyes were glued to the document. The first page she was staring at was simple, yet devastating. It was the deed to the house. Not the original deed from my grandparents, but a new one. 2 years ago, I began, my voice clear and steady, addressing the whole room. "When Grandpa's will was read, you all assumed I inherited this house free and clear. You were wrong." I let that sink in. Grandpa was a wonderful man, but he wasn't a perfect businessman in his later years. He and Grandma had taken out a sizable reverse mortgage on the property to cover their medical expenses. They didn't tell anyone because they were proud. When they passed, that debt came due. My parents' faces went ashen. They knew about the mortgage. They had been counting on it forcing a sale. The bank wanted its money, I continued. The estate didn't have enough liquid cash to cover it without selling assets that were meant to be part of the trust fund. You all pressured me to sell the house, remember? You said it was the only sensible option. It was, my father blurted out. We could have split the proceeds. It would have been fair. Fair, I repeated, the word tasting like ash. But I didn't sell. Instead, I spent the first 6 months as executor negotiating with the bank. And when the negotiations were complete, I used my own money, the money from my quaint little job that you all mock, along with a carefully structured loan against the trust that I control, to satisfy the debt. I didn't just pay off the mortgage, I bought the note. I bought the deed from the bank. I looked directly at Clara, whose face was now a mess of tears and dawning horror. The document you're holding, sister, is the fully executed, legally binding deed to this property. It shows that the owner is not the Whitaker family estate. The owner is me. Alex Whitaker. Personally. You're not in your family home. You're in my house. A collective gasp went around the table. And since you so graciously voted me out of the family, I said, my voice hardening slightly, that means you are all, technically, uninvited guests. Trespassers, if we want to be precise. My mother made a small, wounded sound. Alex, how could you? You let us live here, thinking. Thinking what? I shot back, a sliver of my long-suppressed anger finally showing. That you could bully me into giving you my inheritance? That you could live here rent-free, belittling me at every turn, while I quietly paid for everything? Did you think the utilities paid themselves? The property taxes? The constant repairs? I pointed to the second page in the folder. Turn the page, Clara. Reluctantly, her trembling hands fumbled with the paper. The next document was a thick stack of receipts and bank statements. At the top, A summary page I had typed up myself read, Property Taxes and Maintenance, 2021 to 2023. Those are the property tax bills for the last 2 years, I said. Marked past due and final notice. They were being sent here, but someone, I glanced at my father, who suddenly looked very interested in a spot on the ceiling, kept throwing them away, assuming the estate would handle it. The county was 3 weeks away from putting a lien on this house. I paid it all. In full. Over $50,000. Then I pointed to the other receipts. That's the new boiler. The roof repair after that big storm last winter. The plumber I had to call when the main line backed up because someone, I glanced at Mark, flushed a bunch of flushable wipes. Every cent, paid for by me. While you all sat around scheming about how to get your fair share. The room was utterly silent now, save for Clara's choked sobs. The arrogance and triumph had evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. They were starting to understand. Not just that they had lost the house, but the sheer scale of their miscalculation. They hadn't just voted out their black sheep brother, they had evicted themselves from their cushy, subsidized lives. Clara, however, still had some fight left in her. She was a cornered animal. You tricked us, she spat, wiping her face with the back of her hand. You deliberately hid this from us. You plotted this. Tricked you? I let out a humorless laugh. I gave you every chance. For 2 years, I have asked for civility. For respect. I have swallowed your insults and your condescension. Did you ever once ask me how the estate was doing? If there were any issues? Or did you just assume it was a bottomless treasure chest for you to plunder? I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. I didn't plot this, Clara. You did. You orchestrated this entire pathetic ceremony. You held a vote. All I did was prepare for the inevitable outcome. You call it plotting, I call it being prepared. Something you and the rest of this family have never been. The folder lay open on the table, a Pandora's box of their own making. They had seen only the first 2 sections, the house and the upkeep. There were 3 more sections, each with a neat, typed label. My Uncle Robert, a man whose bluster was directly proportional to his insecurity, squinted at the folder. He saw the next tab. What's that? He demanded, trying to regain some semblance of authority. What else is in there? I smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. I looked at Clara, whose designer dress and expensive jewelry suddenly looked like a costume. Why don't you show him? I said softly. Turn the page, dear sister. The next section is my personal favorite. It's labeled Clara's Lifestyle. Clara's eyes widened in fresh terror. She slammed the folder shut as if it were on fire. No. This is a private family matter. But we're not family anymore, remember? I countered, my voice dangerously quiet. You just announced it to the whole room. Everyone cheered. So now, this isn't a family matter. It's a business meeting. And I believe my business partners, I gestured to my uncle and father, would be very interested to see how company funds are being spent. Clara clutched the folder to her chest, a useless shield against the truth that was coming for her. The rest of the family was now looking at her not with solidarity, but with a dawning, greedy suspicion. They were starting to turn on each other. The chain was breaking, link by link. And I was the one holding the hammer. Clara held the folder to her chest like a holy relic, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally. She found none. The faces that had been beaming with support just minutes ago were now cold, suspicious masks. My threat about company funds had hit a nerve, particularly with my Uncle Robert. What does he mean, Clara? Robert demanded, his voice a low growl. What company funds? The company was a small, local property management firm started by our grandfather. After his death, Robert had taken over as manager, and Clara, with her supposed business acumen, had been given control of the company's finances and a generous salary. It was meant to be her share of the legacy, a way to appease her. My parents were silent partners, drawing a small stipend. They all believe they owned it. It's nothing, Uncle Robert, Clara stammered, trying to sound dismissive. Alex is just making things up. He's trying to divide us. Oh, I don't need to divide you, I said, walking slowly around the table until I was standing behind her. You've done a fine job of that on your own. Open the folder, Clara. Or I'll be happy to provide everyone with their own copies. I brought extras. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. With a shaking hand, she placed the folder back on the table and flipped it open to the third section, the one titled Clara's Lifestyle. The section began with a summary page, just like the last one. It detailed a corporate credit card, the one issued to Clara for business expenses. Beneath the summary were dozens of pages of credit card statements, with certain purchases highlighted in fluorescent yellow. I picked up the top statement. Let's see. March. A trip to Aspen. Booked for 2. Round-trip airfare, a 5-star hotel, ski passes. All on the company card. The expense report you filed lists it as a real estate conference in Denver. The problem is, Clara, there was no conference. I checked. But there was a rather lavish charity gala that you and your husband attended. I have the pictures from the society pages right here. I tapped a glossy printout attached to the statement. Clara shrank in her chair. Her husband, who wasn't present, was a man who lived well beyond his means, propped up by her. Let's move on to May, I continued, my voice relentless. A $5,000 handbag from a boutique on Rodeo Drive. What was the business purpose for that, I wonder? Client acquisition? I flipped the page. July. Weekly spot treatments. Team morale building, your report says. Funny, I spoke to the 2 other employees at the firm. They've never even had a company-paid lunch. My Aunt Carol, Robert's wife, gasped. She was a woman who prided herself on being frugal. The look she gave Clara was venomous. It goes on, I said, tossing the statement onto the table. Designer clothes, Michelin star restaurants, luxury car payments. Over $150,000 in 2 years, all siphoned from the company account and disguised as business expenses. Uncle Robert snatched the papers from the table. His face, already ruddy, turned a shade of deep purple as he scanned the charges. I never approved these, he stammered, looking from the papers to Clara. You told me the business was barely breaking even. You said we had to cut my salary last year. This is where it gets interesting, Uncle Robert, I said, enjoying the moment far more than I probably should have. You see, you think you're the one running the company. You're not. I gestured to another document in the folder. When Grandpa passed, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. You had mismanaged it terribly. The books were a mess, and you were losing clients left and right. Robert's face fell. It was the truth, and he knew it. Grandpa knew it, too. In the months before he died, he took action. He couldn't bear to see his life's work crumble. So, using the private family trust, he arranged for a massive capital infusion to save it. But there was a condition. The infusion came in the form of a sale of controlling interest. He sold 80% of the company's shares. I paused, letting them absorb the information. My father was leaning forward, his mouth agape. He sold them to me, I finished quietly. The documents were signed a month before he passed. For the last 2 years, Uncle Robert, you haven't been the owner. You've been an employee. And Clara, I turned to her, you haven't been stealing from the family business. You've been embezzling from my company. The word embezzling hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a criminal accusation, not just a family squabble. The game had changed entirely. Clara was openly weeping now, not tears of sorrow, but of sheer, unadulterated panic. I'll pay it back, she cried, looking at me with pleading eyes. I can pay it back, Alex. Please. With what? I asked coldly. The money you don't have? The house you just lost? The job you're about to lose? Suddenly, another voice piped up. It was my mother. But the money for our Aunt Beatrice, she said, her voice trembling. Aunt Beatrice was my grandfather's elderly sister, who lived in an assisted living facility. The family had agreed that the company would pay her expenses. Clara was handling that. She said the payments were all up to date. I slowly shook my head. I didn't even need to say anything. I just looked at Clara. The realization dawned on everyone at once. Aunt Carol let out a horrified whisper. Oh, Clara. No. Clara's face crumpled completely. This was the one betrayal that even this morally bankrupt group couldn't stomach. Stealing from a faceless company was one thing. But from their sweet, frail, 88-year-old aunt? The facility called me 3 months ago, I said, my voice low and filled with a cold fury I didn't have to fake. They said the payments were 6 months in arrears. They were about to evict her. An 88-year-old woman. They only called me because I was listed as the emergency contact on Grandpa's old paperwork. I looked around the table, at each of their horrified faces. While Clara was buying Chanel bags and going on ski trips, Aunt Beatrice was days away from being put out on the street. Of course, I covered the balance immediately. And I've been paying for her care ever since. The family was silent, the weight of Clara's depravity crushing them. She was no longer the powerful matriarch, she was a common thief, a pariah. They stared at her with a mixture of disgust and terror. If she could do that, what else had she done? Uncle Robert threw the statements down on the table. He looked broken, defeated, and utterly humiliated. He had been played for a fool by his own niece, in a company he thought was his. But his ordeal wasn't over. I let the silence stretch out, twisting the knife. Then, I turned my attention to him. You're right to be angry, Uncle Robert, I said, my tone shifting from accusatory to something almost conspiratorial. She betrayed your trust. She made you look like a fool. He nodded, grabbing onto the lifeline of shared anger. She did. She's a thief. But here's the thing, I continued, my voice dropping again. Clara's spending only explains about half of the company's missing profits from the last year. I had my accountant do a full audit. There's another, bigger hole in the finances. A series of large, regular cash withdrawals. Untraceable. I picked up the folder and flipped to the next section. I looked Robert dead in the eye. A flicker of panic entered his gaze. He knew what was coming. Now, Robert, I said, holding up the tab for him to see. The moment Uncle Robert saw the label on that tab, the righteous anger drained from his face, replaced by the same chalky fear that had consumed Clara. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His wife, Aunt Carol, stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to a slow, dawning horror. Atlantic City? Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert, you told me you were going to those quarterly supplier meetings in Philadelphia. Robert didn't answer. He just stared at the folder, a condemned man watching the gallows being built. I didn't need to be cruel. The documents would do the work for me. I opened the section and laid out the evidence. Casino ATM withdrawal slips. Bank statements showing cash advances drawn from the company account at specific, recurring times. A detailed log, cross-referenced with his supplier meeting calendar, showing a perfect correlation. It seems your suppliers are named Caesar, Bally, and Hera, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Over $80,000 in cash withdrawn from casino floors over the last 18 months. That's the other half of the missing money, Robert. You weren't just letting Clara rob the company blind, you were helping her do it, just from the other side. Carol let out a choked sob. You're gambling, you promised me you had stopped. You swore it. She looked at him with eyes full of a decade of patched-over pain and broken promises. The last time his gambling had surfaced, they'd nearly lost their own house. It was a wound that had never truly healed. I was going to pay it back. Robert blustered, his voice cracking. It was the same pathetic excuse Clara had used. I just had a run of bad luck. I was going to win it all back. The gambler's prayer, I said with a sigh. Robert, the company is insolvent. It has more debt than assets. Thanks to you and Clara, it's worthless. In fact, it's less than worthless. Because as the majority shareholder who just discovered rampant fraud and embezzlement, I am legally obligated to report this. Or I could be held liable myself. The threat of legal action, of police and courts, hung heavy in the room. This was no longer about a house or an inheritance. This was about freedom. But don't worry, I added, turning my gaze to the final two people at the table. My parents. You're all in this together. My father, who had been trying to make himself as small as possible, flinched. My mother looked at me, her eyes pleading. Alex, please. We didn't know about any of this. We had no idea. Oh, I know you didn't know about this, I said, gesturing to the financial mess. You were too busy with your own schemes. I turned to the final section of the folder. It was thinner than the others, but in many ways, it was the most damning. The tab simply read, "The will." You've all spent 2 years complaining about Grandpa's will, I said, my voice low and intense. You've called me a thief, a cheat, the undeserving favorite. You've painted yourselves as the victims of an old man's sentimental whim. Would you like to know the real reason Grandpa and Grandma left everything to me? No one spoke. They just stared, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They didn't do it because they loved me more, I said, the words catching slightly in my throat. It was a truth that still pained me. They did it because they had lost all respect for you. I pulled out the first document. It was an application for a reverse mortgage, filled out and signed by my parents. The date on it was from 3 years ago, while my grandparents were both still alive and living in this very house. You tried to take out a second, fraudulent mortgage on their home, I said, my voice thick with disgust. Behind their backs. You were trying to strip the equity from their house while they were still living in it. You were caught only because the loan officer did his due diligence and called Grandpa to confirm. You thought he was too senile to understand. He wasn't. My mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. My father just stared at the document, exposed and ashamed. This is why they changed their will, I said, my voice rising with the passion of a man defending the dead. It wasn't about my quaint blog or your real jobs. It was about character. They saw you for what you were, greedy, disrespectful, and willing to prey on your own parents in their time of vulnerability. They saw Clara's entitlement, Robert's weakness, and your naked avarice. I pulled out the last piece of paper from the folder. It was a handwritten letter, penned in my grandmother's elegant cursive. They left this letter for me, with their lawyer. It explained everything. They didn't give me the estate as a gift. They gave it to me as a burden. A responsibility. They knew you would all come after it, and they trusted me to protect their legacy from you. This folder, this isn't my revenge. This is their final act of defense. They gave me the truth as a shield. I let the letter fall onto the table, on top of the pile of broken lives and shattered lies. The Whitaker family legacy. A full accounting. The room was a tomb. The bonds of family, already frayed, had been utterly annihilated. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at each other, their eyes filled with accusation and betrayal. Clara, the embezzler. Robert, the gambler. My parents, the ghouls who tried to rob the living. They had formed a united front to cast me out, but in the end, their own sins had destroyed them. There was no family left to be voted out of. I finally walked back to my chair and picked up my briefcase. I snapped it shut. The sound was loud and final in the deafening silence. You voted me out, I said, my voice now calm and decisive. I accept your vote. We are no longer family. Therefore, our business relationship is hereby terminated. I looked at each of them in turn. Clara, I expect your resignation from the company effective immediately. Don't worry about legal action, being disowned and disgraced is punishment enough, provided you never speak to me again. Robert, you're fired. The company will be audited and professionally dissolved. Any creditors will be directed to you both, personally. Then, I looked at my parents. At Clara. At Robert and Carol and their now weeping children. As for the house, this house, my house, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. Be out by the end of December. If you are not, I will have you removed for trespassing. An eviction notice will be formally served to you all tomorrow morning. I turned and walked towards the front door. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, filled with a mixture of hatred, shock, and a horrifying, dawning respect. My hand was on the doorknob when my mother's voice, frail and broken, called out. Alex, where will we go? I paused for a moment, my back still to them. I thought about all the years of insults, the condescension, the utter lack of faith in me. I thought about their cheering as they cast me out. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp November air. Frankly, I said, without turning around, I don't care. I closed the door behind me, leaving them to the ruins of the Thanksgiving they had so carefully planned. 1 year later. The smell of Thanksgiving filled my house. It was a warm, comforting blanket of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and cinnamon from the pumpkin pie. There was no metallic scent of tension, no bitter aroma of resentment. There was only the sound of gentle chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft jazz playing from a speaker in the corner. The year since the vote had been a whirlwind of painful, but necessary, demolition and reconstruction. As promised, the eviction notices were served the next day. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for them, but liberating for me. Clara was the first to break completely. Without my company's salary and her access to its funds, her lavish lifestyle imploded. Her husband, who had married her for the wealth she projected, left her within 2 months, citing irreconcilable differences, which was a polite term for the money ran out. She had to sell her car, her designer wardrobe, and her jewelry to avoid the bankruptcy I had offered to spare her from. The last I heard, she was living in a small, 1-bedroom apartment across town, working as a receptionist. We have not spoken a single word since that night. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol's marriage did not survive the revelation of his gambling. Carol left him, taking the kids. She called me once, about 6 months ago. It was an awkward, tearful call. She apologized for her part in it, for her silence, for going along with the crowd. I accepted her apology. Robert, stripped of his job and his family, had to sell his house to cover his debts. He now works at a home improvement store. I see him sometimes when I'm buying supplies for the house. We don't acknowledge each other. My parents were perhaps the most tragic. They had nowhere to go. Their pride was shattered, their reputation and their social circle ruined. They had to sell their own heavily mortgaged home and move into a senior apartment complex. My mother sends me long, rambling emails every few weeks, filled with guilt, regret, and passive-aggressive pleas for reconciliation. I read them, but I don't reply. The wound they inflicted, trying to steal from my grandparents, is too deep. Trust, once incinerated, doesn't grow back. For the first few months, I lived in an empty house that echoed with ghosts and bad memories. I methodically purged every trace of them. I packed up their belongings and had them delivered to their new, diminished addresses. I repainted the walls, tore out the old carpets, and redesigned the dining room where the execution had taken place. I filled the home not with their oppressive portraits and stuffy antiques, but with light, with art, with books, and with life. The company was dissolved. The lawyers found more debt than I had anticipated, but the trust fund, now properly managed, absorbed the costs. What was left of the Whitaker family legacy was finally clean, and it was mine. Most importantly, I ensured that Aunt Beatrice's care was endowed for the rest of her life. I visit her twice a week. She's sharp as a tack and funny as hell. She pats my hand and tells me my grandparents would be proud. She is the only blood relative I have left who I consider family. And today, she was sitting at the head of my table. The dining room was full, but not with the faces of my past. My found family was here. There was my best friend, David, and his wife and kids, who had been my rock through all of this. There was my lawyer, a good man who had become a good friend, and his partner. There was a couple of artists I admired and had befriended through my quaint blog. And there was my cousin Sarah. Sarah had called me a week after the Thanksgiving disaster. She was the only one who did. She was sobbing, ashamed. She confessed she had been swept up in the group mentality, pressured by her parents and Clara. She hated what they had done, what she had been a part of. It was a genuine, heartfelt apology, with no strings attached. I was cautious at first, but over the year, she proved her sincerity. She distanced herself from her parents' toxicity and was building her own life, on her own terms. She asked if she could come today, and I said yes. Forgiveness, I was learning, could be a selective process. Aunt Beatrice was telling a story about my grandfather in his youth, and the table was roaring with laughter. It was a genuine, warm sound that filled every corner of the room. This house, which had once felt like a prison of obligation, now felt like a sanctuary. A home. I looked at the faces around my table. These people valued me for who I was, not for what they could get from me. They celebrated my successes and supported my passions. They didn't see an art blog, they saw a career I had built from scratch. They didn't see a black sheep, they saw a friend. Later, as David helped me clear the plates, he put a hand on my shoulder. "You doing okay, man?" he asked, his eyes full of concern. "I know this day must be weird for you." I looked around the room, at the smiling faces, at the warm glow of the lights. I thought of the folder, now locked away in a safe deposit box, a relic of a past life. The screaming, the accusations, the hollow victory in their eyes. It all felt like a scene from a movie I had watched a long time ago. The pain had been real, a searing fire that had burned away the rot. But from those ashes, something new and far better had grown. I smiled, a real smile, one that reached my eyes. "I've never been better," I said, and I meant it. I picked up a bottle of champagne and filled everyone's glasses. I stood at the head of the table, in the spot where Clara had stood a year ago to cast me out. "I just want to say something," I began, and all conversation stopped. A year ago, I learned a hard lesson about what family isn't. But this year, all of you have taught me what family truly is. It's not about blood. It's about respect, about love, and about showing up for each other, no matter what. I raised my glass. So, to my real family. To new beginnings. I am truly, deeply thankful for every single one of you. A chorus of cheers, and to Alex, echoed through the room. As I took a sip, I met Aunt Beatrice's eyes. She gave me a small, knowing nod. In that moment, I knew my grandparents' legacy was safe. It wasn't in the house or the money. It was right here, in this room, in the warmth and the laughter and the love. They hadn't burdened me. They had set me free.